In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between Kanban boards and Scrum boards and help you figure out which one will work best for your team and your team's needs. So if we come here to this Atlassian documentation for Kanban boards versus Scrum, here they have a very helpful table at the bottom. Now, before I go into detail on this table, I just want to give you an idea of what Kanban can be used for. Kanban is typically used for ongoing work that just flows in, your team works on it and flows out. And so your team picks up something, it's in progress, it goes on to the next step for testing, and then your team picks up another piece of work, and then it goes on to the next part of the process, and it just keeps moving. It's just this ongoing cycle. And so a really good example for a Kanban board would be following a manufacturing process. And so here you can see in Atlassian's documentation for Kanban, they have lean manufacturing as its origin. And that's because Kanban boards can really provide a visual on where something is throughout the manufacturing process. So for example, if you're kitting something and grabbing all of the materials so that it can go and actually be built, then it's in the kit stage. Once it's fully kitted, then it's ready for build. Once there's capacity to be built, you can pick it up and build on it, and then it goes on to test and so on and so forth. And so as something is kitted, and then it's ready to be built, and then it starts being built, the next thing can be kitted and then be ready to kit. And so you have just this ongoing continuous flow of work that you can pull metrics on and then also visualize with that Kanban board. Scrum, however, was developed for software development, and so that's where that origin really comes from. What's helpful for Scrum is it really does help you time box the amount of work that you're going to do in a certain sprint. So in that fixed period of time, whether that's 1 week, whether that's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks, it really does support that continuous integration and continuous deliveries with CI/CD framework. And so how would you determine which one that your team needs? Whether you are a software development team or you're a consulting team or a combination of the two, if you want to time box the amount of work that your team will be doing, say for the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, month, then a Scrum board is probably ideal for you. This way you can plan out what you're going to do over the next 2 weeks. You commit to that work, your team knows what they're going to work on over the next 2 weeks, and then they complete that work while you're preparing the upcoming 2 weeks, and then you work on that next fixed period of time box work in your sprint. The caveat with Scrum, however, is that you do need someone to create those sprints in Jira, and then you need someone to start those sprints, monitor those sprints, complete those sprints. And so there is some overhead work associated with Scrum and with sprints. You need to have that knowledge in Jira to be able to do those, and I'll show you what that looks like in Jira in just a little bit. Whereas with Kanban, because your Kanban board is set up and it's just continuously flowing of work in and work out, work in and work out. So you pick up from the backlog, you work on it, go through the process, you mark it as done. You pick up the next, goes through the process and marks as done. Because the Kanban board works like that, there's less overhead and less upkeep. You don't need to create a sprint, you don't need to plan a sprint, you don't need to start a sprint, complete a sprint, do a sprint review. And so if your team doesn't have the capacity or the ability to time box and plan those sprints or learn how to set up sprints within Jira, then maybe Kanban will work for your team for the time being until you can maybe get that support and train someone to create those sprints for your team, or have a project manager or a Scrum Master that can help your team figure out what work they're going to work on and plan that work for the next upcoming time box frame or sprint. And so that's just one way that I've figured out how to use a Scrum board versus a Kanban board. But let me go ahead and show you what that looks like in Jira. The reason that I want to show you what this looks like in Jira is because any project can have both a Scrum and a Kanban board. And so you can set up both a Scrum board and a Kanban board for one project for your team, and your team can decide whether they want to use the Scrum board and plan their work in sprints, or if they want to use a Kanban board and just continuously pick up the next thing on the backlog. So let's go ahead and go over to Jira, and I'll show you what a Scrum board looks like, and then I'll show you what a Kanban board looks like. Here you can see I'm in the Development 2.0 project, and I'm under the Development Scrum board. This is a sprint, so we're in a Dev 2 Sprint 1. Here you can see in the top right-hand corner, I have a button that says Complete Sprint, and then here you can also see that I'm grouping my work by epics. You can group your work by different things like assignee, like stories, like which project it's from, but I prefer epics. That's because I use epics in my project as project milestones or features that need to be completed or addressed. And so With that, you can hit the epic dropdown and you can see what work is underneath this epic that needs to be worked on within this sprint. Up at the top, you can also filter by assignee. So if you click on user icon, you can filter and see what work is specific to this person. So if you are running a stand-up for your team and you're reviewing where work currently is throughout your process, you can click on that assignee's icon, and then it'll only show things that are assigned to that person. This is a Scrum board. So again, this is working in a fixed time box, right? The way that you're going to plan your work for a sprint is you're actually going to use the backlog. So if you click the backlog button here on the left-hand side, you'll see that we have a Dev 2 Sprint 1, you have a Dev 2 Sprint 2, and then here I have a Sprint 3. Here you can see on the backlog that I have all the other stories in my backlog that may or may not need to be worked on. So if I wanted to create another sprint, this is where you would create a sprint here. This is something that we'll go into a little bit more depth on in another video, but this is how you would plan your work. When you are ready to complete a sprint, what you can do is you can either hit the complete sprint button for the current active sprint here, or you can hit that complete sprint button that was on the active sprint itself, so the board itself. So if you wanted to complete a sprint, the way that it would look is you would plan the sprint, you'd put your tasks in there, you would start it, and then here you would hit that complete sprint button. It says complete Dev 2 Sprint 1. So it says it can't be completed because they're incomplete subtasks. So let's go ahead and open that up. Let's close out these subtasks. So let's go ahead and mark this as done. Okay, and let's go back to our sprint and let's go ahead and hit complete sprint. Here you can now see that we've been prompted. It said this sprint contains 1 completed issue and 3 open issues. It gives you the option to move any open issues to the next upcoming sprint, a new sprint, or the backlog. I'm going to move these open issues to the next sprint, so I'm going to go ahead and hit complete sprint. Once you hit complete sprint, you'll see that all of those other tasks have gone and populated in the new sprint. And this is where you can start the sprint or you can continue your sprint planning, where you can pull things from the backlog. You can either click and drag them into the sprint, or you can right click. You can go to move to, and you can add them to the sprint as you see fit. Once you've finished your sprint planning, everyone has agreed upon what they're working on during the upcoming sprint. You can go ahead and start that sprint. And here's a window that's going to pop up that says, how long do you want your sprint to be? If you choose 2 weeks, we can choose today as the start date, and then the end date will automatically populate 2 weeks after that start date. And here's where you can enter a sprint goal. So you can go ahead and hit start. The other thing that you can do is, since we completed that first sprint, you can go to reports. And this is where you can view a sprint report, so you can analyze how well you did to completing the work you said you were going to complete in the last time box or the last sprint. So again, if you do choose a sprint board for your team, there is a lot of overhead that goes with it, like sprint planning. So creating those sprints, moving the tasks into the sprint that you want to work on, setting the time frame for the sprint in which you want to complete them, and then completing that sprint, and then also conducting a sprint review. So that is following the Scrum framework with all of those different meetings. But here you can see this is the sprint report. So again, issues that weren't completed that we said we were going to complete in that sprint, and then issues that were removed from the sprint are populated here as well. And so there's just trade-offs to a sprint board and a Kanban board. It depends on your team and their ability to be able to create and manage sprints for your project and for your work and for your team, or it also depends on the type of work that you're doing and if you want to have that fixed time box for a sprint. The other option that you have, aside from a Scrum board, is a Kanban board. And so here, if you hit your boards drop down, if you only have a Scrum board created, you will need to create a board. And I'll go over creating a board and configuring a board in a later video. But here I already have a Kanban board created. So let's go ahead and navigate over to that Kanban board, and I'll show you the differences between the Scrum board and the Kanban board. Now here you can see, if you do have a Kanban board and you navigate to it, it may look a little different. Again, I like grouping my work by the epic, so I want to know what project milestone it's under, right? And so here you can see that I have all these different epics here that weren't populating in the Scrum board, but they are populating in this Kanban board. So here you can see I have this epic that's closed, right? And here you can see that there's a story underneath it that's not closed. So let's go ahead and move this to done. And what that does is it also shows you just that the Kanban board will pull everything under the sun that you have for your project as issues and on the backlog. So here you can see I have issues without epics, right? So everything that could possibly be worked on that's on the backlog is populating in this to-do column. You can narrow it down through something called subfilters. Subfilters are only available for company managed Kanban boards. And what I mean by this is it allows you to filter down a little bit more on just the information that you want to see. So for example, in your Kanban board, if you don't want to view anything that's done, you can create a subfilter that doesn't show anything that's done or filters out anything that's been closed for over a week. That way you can only see the things that were completed in the last week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it is you set that parameter to. The other thing you can do on a board is you can also create quick filters. Quick filters are another way that you can narrow down what it is you want to search for. There are some that are defaults that are automatically created, or you can go into board configuration and create those quick filters as well using JQL. Now, the reason that Kanban might be helpful is, again, maybe you have a manufacturing process where something is in to-do, and then it's going to be in kit, and then it's going to be built, and then it's going to be tested, and then it's going to be marked as done. That would be a very nice, very wonderful visual for you to have throughout the manufacturing process so you know where things are at and whether or not an assembler is ready to go ahead and pick up the next kit and what kit they should pick up based on the priority and urgency of the shipping date of the product. And so that's one way that a Kanban board can be helpful. The other way a Kanban board can be helpful is if your team just doesn't have the capacity or the knowledge to really go and plan those sprints. Make sure everyone gets pulled together to have those conversations on, okay, what are we going to work on over the next 2 weeks? Are we going to be able to complete everything that's in progress right now by the time the current sprint ends? How much work should we pull in to the next sprint? So having those conversations, planning out those sprints, creating those sprints, and then completing those sprints, reviewing them, and then starting the next one. So if your team doesn't have the capacity to hold those meetings, or if they don't have the permissions or the knowledge to create sprints within Jira, then a Kanban board might be helpful. Sure, it'll show everything under the sun that's on your project for its backlog, but you will just be able to go into project kickoff for your project, see where it's at, move the next thing into progress, move that to done and say, okay, well, what's next? Let's pick up the next thing, right, in this project milestone. So these are the differences between Kanban and Scrum boards. I hope this video was helpful in helping you really just determine what board your team should or should not be using based on capacity, resources, and the type of work that your team typically does.